Buenos días. Voy a empezar en castellano o portuñol, como yo digo, para felicitar a Manuel Ruiz Chaves por este magnífico congreso y también la IAB. Agradecer la invitación que me han hecho para aquí estar y decir que es un grande honor para mí. Saludar también mis compañeros de mesa y todos ustedes que aquí están. And my topic today here is the new European regulation on clinical trials. I think that this regulation is not only interesting for the 28 member states that compose the European Union, but I truly believe that it's interesting for all of you, for the entire world. For two main reasons. First of all, it confirms a new model of policy for clinical trials. And secondly, it goes in a totally different direction of the one that has been pursued for the majority of the countries. I will start by going through very briefly the first European initiatives, mainly to point out that it's a coherent path that goes from the very beginning until today. And then I will go to consider the proposal of the regulation. This is very important to understand. The proposal comes from the European Commission, and this proposal was made in 2012. This proposal was very, very controversial, especially in what concerns the ethical issues. Later, we have the regulation on clinical trials that was approved last April, so it's brand new. And the regulation also address, of course, two main ethical issues, the ethics committees and the informed consent. Because you could ask me, why don't you go straight to the regulation and you start by talking about the proposal? The proposal, it was 2 years ago. Yes, that's true, but the proposal, which was very, very controversial, in my view, does reflect the real perspective, the real intention of the European Commission in what concerns clinical trials. I don't think that it was surpassed. It remains, it's persistent, and if we have any doubts about that, by considering the whole path since the very beginning until today, we'll see there's a coherent project here. So it really deserves attention, the proposal of the Commission. So the first European initiatives, there was one directive in 1965, a second one in 1975. These two directives were not really dedicated to clinical trials, but they did create a framework for clinical trials in Europe. Then the directive of 2001 that is still in force. This one was really dedicated to clinical trials, and it presented a very extensive and detailed ethical requirements. We can say in a very general way that these three directives did draw a path, a very coherent one, that became clear each step of the way. It's just like a project that unfolds. And there are major orientations in these three directives. The first one is harmonization. If you read the directive of 2001, recital 1, you see that the harmonization is quite clear there. Approximation of the laws of the member states, or also here, uniform rules on the compilation of dossiers, including their presentation. So harmonization is the word of order. There's another main direction in these directives, centralization. Centralization, recital 8, we read in a single opinion for each member state. So you see, if we talk about centralization in Europe, this goes in a totally different direction of what we see in the other countries, because we are talking about one IRB in each country. We are talking about one single position, approval or refusal in each country. And what we saw in Europe until 2001, what we see now in the rest of the world is several IRBs, one IRB in each healthcare facility. Ethically speaking, I would say that these first European initiatives do have very strong ethical concerns, especially the directive. And I point out some of them here. Reinforce quality and safety, the ethical principles, protection of rights with risk assessment, data protection, persons who are incapable of giving legal consents. It's also in the directive of 2001 that ethics committees are established in a compulsory way for an approval of clinical trial, but again, one for each member state. And very important, it's also introduced the obligation of insurance. If we go now, so this is the three directives, the one that is still in force, and now we move on to the proposal of a regulation. Just a change of directive to a regulation, we see immediately that the harmonization is becoming stronger, because a directive can be changed in each member state. A regulation imposes itself as it is, so there's no change whatsoever. So, in what concerns the proposal, the one that was made by the European Commission in 2012, we see that the harmonization becomes stronger. And we have here, again, a single administrative decision by member state concerned, but we have one single decision for all European Union. We add to harmonization also simplification. Simplification, for instance, single entry, one application dossier, single submission, single safety report for 28 member states. We can go a little further and see that besides harmonization and simplification, we have also facilitation of procedures. And I draw your attention, for instance, for the possibility of not reporting adverse events if the protocol provides already this possibility. Reduce timelines for authorization, a possibility of tacit authorization of clinical trials, so everything becomes quite easy. And again, centralization. But here we have a little something, not only centralization of procedures that were already in place in the directives, but we have, and this is very important, we have decentralization in what concerns ethical review and insurance. So two major topics of ethical concerns. They are not centralized anymore. They become decentralized. And the proposal doesn't even refer to them as compulsory. So, ethical procedures are set by the proponents of this regulation. Ethical procedures are said to be lengthy and impossible to harmonize. Therefore, either they fall out of the proposal, as they did, or they become responsible for the member states, as they now are in the new regulation. It's very difficult to understand these kind of arguments because, of course, it is possible to have some kind of harmonization in ethical issues. Europe has the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have many international and legal documents. We have standards for minimal ethics. So harmonization is possible. But even if it wasn't, we would ask, and insurance is not possible either to harmonize? That's very interesting. That's a very interesting question. If it is not possible to harmonize, if it becomes a responsibility for the state member, then I would ask, we can have two European citizens that are under the very same clinical trial that can suffer the same injuries, but if they are in two different member states, they receive different compensation. This is something that we have to look in more detail. Of course, this picture can be easily understood if we read the exposition, the introduction of the proposal, where it is said that the number of the applications for clinical trials in Europe between 2007 and 2011 fell 25%. That costs for conducting clinical trials have increased. Staff have doubled, increase of administrative costs, insurance fees have increased 800%. And the average of delay launching a clinical trial has increased 90%. And this is not the only thing that we read in the introduction of the proposal. We also read which are the objectives. Ensure attractiveness of EU for conducting clinical trials. Establishment and functioning the internal market as regards clinical trials and medicinal products for human use. That is, clinical trials are seen now as an economic sector and the engine of economic development. So no one really wants that sponsors prefer outsource his clinical trials towards countries having less strict laws. Europe really wants to make the European Union as attractive as possible. So, while the majority of the world's countries are reducing the number of clinical trials, the EU wants to increase their number. While the majority of the world's countries are committed to more strict rules, the EU wants to soften the clinical trial rules and to become more attractive. Well, from the ethical point of view, the proposal presents two major problems. Ethics committees are no longer considered. And informed consent is not very well developed, and it presents also a brand new possibility of skipping informed consent in emergency situations. So this was the proposal. The proposal was reviewed by the European Parliament, by the European Council, and now we go very fast to my third and last point, that is the regulation. And indeed, in this regulation, it was possible to make some important revisions, because I considered that the European Commission's proposal neglected a significant part of the most relevant bioethical reflection of the past years, namely in what concerns ethics committees and the strong requirements for informed consent. Now I'm going to show you in the next slides, excuse me, just forgot to point out here the two main ethical issues that I will focus, ethics committees and informed consent. And in the next slides, I will show you what is now in the regulation that was approved last April, that will come in force in 2016, what is now in the regulation, but it was totally absent from the proposal. And I think that it speaks by itself. Definition of an ethics committee was totally absent. Well, here, member states are the only responsible to organize the involvement of the ethics committees. It's now in the regulation and at least gives member states this possibility. Research projects should be reviewed. It was not, it's now. Ethical review from ethics committees, prior requirement, it was not, it's now. And ethics committees advice binding. We cannot forget that this was deleted in the proposal. It is now, fortunately, in the regulation. Ethical and scientific quality. This is what concerns to ethical committees. Let's move on to informed consent. I believe that the new regulation now, in what concerns informed consent, has tripled the size of the articles of informed consent. It's a very, I would dare to say, that now the regulation presents a very, very good overall statement about informed consent, the more complete that I know, but it was not so. Everything that I'm going to show you now, it was totally absent from the proposal. Prior informed consent, information in a prior interview in a clear language, opportunity to ask questions, time to consider the decision, consideration of specific situations. These specific situations, moving too fast, these specific situations that can affect free decision making are economically and socially disadvantaged groups. So all these details are now considered. Additional requirements in case of minors, incapacitated subjects, minimal burden, no undue influence, including that of financial nature, and there's more to come. Special attention paid to the information needs of individual subjects, confirmation that the information was understood, and this is very rare to see, and I'm glad that it's now in the regulation. Detailed specification of duly information, involvement of a minor capable of assenting, of course, clinical trials on incapacitated subjects and minors, enlargement, this is also interesting, enlargement of the vulnerable population, explicitly considered, such as pregnant and breastfeeding women and others. And here on the others, we talk about militaries, prisoners, and also, well, additional safeguards to clinical trials in emergency situations. This is something that is, for me, still open as a major problem. Sometimes people tell me, well, we really need, from the medical point of view, to have the possibility of engaging in a clinical trial in emergency situations. And in this case, we do not have time. There's no possibility to ask for informed consent. I proposed at the European Parliament that the same system that we have now in organ donation, with the possibility of opting out, would be also applicable in these cases. That is, we would have a national registration for people that would not want to engage in a clinical trial in an emergency situation. This was totally neglected, so it means that for every European citizen that goes in an emergency situation, he can become a subject of a clinical trial under specific situation, under specific requirements. It's true that are much tougher now than they were in the proposal of the Commission. And in conclusion, the proposal of the European Commission was duly reviewed, but remains a very important indicator for the future steps in what concerns clinical trials. The EU regulation will have strong implication, I believe, in the rest of the world, because it will become in force in 2016 for 28 member states. It's impossible not to have an impact in the rest of the world. I believe that it can strengthen a similar orientation already existing in the USA. There are a lot of papers about how different IRBs in the States issue different opinions about the very same clinical trial. And that puts a questions that, of course, the new European regulation answers. I believe that reducing the number of the CTs, the clinical trials in South America and Africa, because for Europe now, the clinical trials are a question of economic development. Europeans want to have more and more clinical trials in Europe. So it's a question for them of competing with the other parts of the world. So I believe that if they succeed, the number of clinical trials can decrease in other parts of the world. Some current discussions, very hot discussions in what concerns placebo or double standards, will lose somehow their importance if this regulation has the implication that I foresee. Oh, and of course, it is also a question of proliferation of IRBs in these regions, since now in the European Union, we have just one single decision for the entire 28 member states. And my very last, well, that is the very last. Let me go to the other one. I believe that it does inaugurate a new paradigm in the clinical history, clinical trials history. First, it was science, the major value before the Second World War. After the Second World War, ethics was the most important perspective for clinical trials. And now it seems that market will be the most important one. Thank you so much.